There is a lot going on right now.
The past week brought some more bad news for the province and its fragile economy.
COVID-19 lockdowns and restrictions have been in place in Canada for more than a year.
In a town of 7,000 people, over 700 were left homeless.
It might feel overwhelming, like we're in unprecedented times, but we aren't the first to feel this way. In 1918, exhausted young soldiers trekked across the country in the Great War's final act. Alongside their weaponry, they unwittingly carried something far deadlier. The Spanish flu bit into the nation and consumed working-class communities. But a lack of social support forced many to face a crushing ultimatum: work while sick or don't work at all. Maybe our times aren't as unprecedented as they seem. Dans ces circonstances difficiles, 30 000 travailleurs de Winnipeg ont pris la courageuse décision de cesser toute activité pour réclamer de meilleures conditions de travail. La grève générale de Winnipeg a duré plusieurs semaines, opposant les travailleurs à leurs employeurs et à un gouvernement ne leur offrant aucun soutien. Ce mouvement a été violemment réprimé, mais ses idées ont pris racine. La population a pris peu à peu conscience que le pouvoir était concentré entre les mains d'une poignée de puissants, que le système économique et social en place excluait de nombreuses personnes, que les Premières Nations, les Inuits, les Métis, les communautés de travailleurs et les immigrés n'avaient pas leur mot à dire. Il fallait que les choses changent. Dans les années qui ont suivi la grève générale, l'aide sociale s'est démocratisée par les biais de programmes mis en place par le gouvernement et d'organismes de bienfaisance. Des syndicats ont été créés, de nouveaux partis politiques ont été implantés et les leaders communautaires de tout le pays ont commencé à imaginer et mettre en œuvre des stratégies innovantes afin de renforcer leur communauté en transférer le pouvoir. All of these efforts shared a common goal to create communities where everyone belongs. In Winnipeg, local economies were beginning to flourish to the benefit of some, while perpetuating inequalities for others. Two beneficiaries of this growth, Elizabeth and William Forbes Alloway, saw this disparity and felt a responsibility to give back. They searched for a model that could strengthen their community and build capacity for Winnipeg to solve their challenges from within. Before long, they discovered a new model emerging from Cleveland, a community trust. In this model, an endowment is set up and controlled by the people who know the changing needs of their community. At its core, it serves to shift power out from a few wealthy philanthropists and into the hands of community members. Sold on the model, the Alloways set aside an initial donation of $100,000 and founded the Winnipeg Foundation, Canada's first community foundation in 1921. Le deuxième don enregistré par le Winnipeg Foundation, 3 pièces d'or, provient d'une personne anonyme. En 1937, la Victoria Foundation, deuxième fondation communautaire créée au Canada, a reçu son premier don, 20 $ de la part de Fanny Gadsden, accompagné à ce message: "That I could afford the $100 to so fine an undertaking." Ces sommes étaient modestes par rapport au montant versé par le couple Alloway, mais d'une grande signification. Peu importe sa classe sociale, toute personne est invitée à contribuer à sa communauté. Slowly but surely, that idea spread, taking hold in cities and communities at a time when Canada was opening its borders to immigration, and the national myth of Canada as a land of acceptance, a mosaic instead of a melting pot, was starting to be written. This is the story Canada chose to tell Canadians at the international community at Expo 67. The event's logo was a circle, linked by symbols representing humanity and infamously lacked the stereotypical Canadian symbols. This design choice was indicative of a growing idea that Canada's potential would be driven by strong communities over individual glory. Naturally, community foundations embraced this philosophy, but noticed a troubling pattern, a bias towards centers of power and influence. What would it mean if those centers were the only communities strong enough to shape Canada's future? This realization galvanized community foundation advocates to bring the model to every peak and valley that would listen, allowing communities to unlock their own strength. In just 2 decades, with the support of the newly created Community Foundations of Canada and other key partners, a network of 42 foundations was approaching 200. representing communities of every size and stature, not just in the centers of power, but rural communities and First Nations tucked away in prairies, mountainsides, and mill towns. It was beginning to seem like community foundations were starting to realize their potential, shifting power back to the people. Cependant, alors que la mission et la structure même des fondations communautaires étaient centrées sur une capacité de décision communautaire, la définition de la communauté n'était pas toujours inclusive. La colonisation, le genre et la classe sociale influent énormément sur la manière dont la richesse était bâtie ou redistribuée dans la société. Ce qui est évidemment influencé le fonctionnement des fondations communautaires créées au sein de cette société. Comment ce modèle pouvait-il donner une place à tous les membres de la communauté alors que le pouvoir décisionnel était toujours concentré entre les mains des personnes plus puissantes et plus fortunées? Meanwhile, the social challenges that made community foundations relevant in the first place continued to get more complex as inequality grew. Reconciliation continued to feel like a faraway prospect, and the newly understood climate emergency placed everything on a deadline. If community foundations were going to rise up to meet the challenges inside their organizations as well as out in the world, they were going to need to evolve once again. Community foundations began to work together, not as individual organizations, but as a national network capable of sharing perspectives, learning, and growing faster than ever before. Across the country, foundations began thinking beyond their granting capacities and started exploring new ways to shift financial capital into community through impact investing. These direct and deliberate investments in projects addressed poverty, clean energy, and more, redefining the way wealth is generated and distributed. But community foundations also realized that their potential impact went far beyond the money they were able to leverage. A new data and community knowledge initiative sprang up in Toronto and spread to over 100 communities across the country and around the globe. By connecting community knowledge and local data, Vital Signs empowered networks of organizations to set shared priorities and drive citizen engagement. Quand des catastrophes surviennent, ces connexions et cette vision permettent une réponse d'urgence et des efforts de relance propulsés par la communauté. Et lorsqu'aucune fondation communautaire n'existe sur place, de nouvelles ont été créées pour contribuer à la reconstruction. Quand des actes haineux ont bouleversé des communautés entières, nombreuses sont celles qui se sont tournées vers leur fondation locale pour mobiliser une réponse. In the shadow of moments like these, calls for greater equality and for a just and equitable future are gaining traction. Community foundations are engaging with women's movements across the country, turning to Black and Indigenous leaders, and listening to voices that have been kept in the margins for most of Canada's history. And as a result, community foundations have begun to examine who holds power, to decolonize their work, and to challenge how resources are mobilized. And in response to a modern global pandemic, 176 community foundations worked alongside partners to ensure community decision-making was embedded in the national response to COVID-19. This was the largest collective undertaking of foundations in Canadian history, responding to a problem so similar to what started it all. The future is full of these familiar challenges: the climate crisis, wealth inequality, and growing movements for racial justice, gender equity, and Indigenous rights. But now we have a century of experience of community leaders learning and taking action together, of shifting power in small and big ways, proving that changing and bringing change is in our DNA. It is together on this bedrock that we will work to advance a future that is bright, just, and sustainable, to relentlessly pursue a future where everyone belongs.